Welcome to the university's activities marking the Martin Luther King holiday, and thanks for coming out on a winter night. Some of you probably noticed that the King holiday was a couple of weeks ago, but the university is not in session, so we usually wait and schedule some activities after the semester starts so the students are around, because that, after all, is what a university is about. And I think it's especially appropriate that the university honor the memory of Martin Luther King Jr. by engaging in a serious discussion of King's role, his role in American life, his role in American history. And tonight's talk is intended to further that objective. It's sponsored by the Martin Luther King Day Committee, supported by President Dennison. And I want to thank President Dennison and members of the Martin Luther King Day Committee for their help. And a special thanks to Kathleen Collins in President Dennison's office. If it weren't for her, we probably would be meeting in a room with no lights, although we tried that a couple of minutes ago anyway. Our speaker would probably be in Denver or Salt Lake. It's an honor tonight to have as our speaker a terrific historian who's going to speak on what turns out to be not only a fascinating but a timely topic. Erwin Gelman is an accomplished scholar whose work has brought him to contemplate some of the most significant events in the developing civil rights movement of the post-World War II era. He earned his BA at the University of Maryland, did his doctorate at Indiana University, and taught at Morgan State, a historically black college where he was also a dean, and at Chapman University, where he was Allergan Chair of Modern American History. He's currently a visiting scholar at Franklin and Marshall College. And unlike most academics, Irv Gelman has actually gone out into the world and made money. He's been in business. But most of all, he's a prolific scholar. He's published in an astonishingly wide variety of professional journals, from the New England Journal of History to the Hispanic American Historical Review, to the Historian, to the American Jewish Historical Quarterly. That's quite an array. He's also a public intellectual of some note. One can find his articles in magazines as diverse as Commonweal and The Nation. He's appeared on C-SPAN, the History Channel, BBC, NPR, and the one that amuses me most, Entertainment Tonight. You can ask me about that later. His books include Roosevelt and Batista, Good Neighbor Diplomacy in Cuba, Good Neighbor Diplomacy, the United States Policy in Latin America, Secret Affairs, Franklin Roosevelt, Cordell Hull, and Sumner Wells, and the one that's most relevant to our topic tonight, The Contender, Richard Nixon, the Congress Years, 1946 to 1972. That volume is the first of a projected multi-volume biography of the 37th president. Right now, he's working on the second volume, which covers the vice presidential years. The Contender presented a startling revisionist portrait of Nixon's early career. David Greenberg's review in the New York Times called The Contender, quote, an impressive feat of archival scholarship, and it is that. He also called it, quote, a masterly achievement of spadework and stamina. Powell's books bluntly asserts that Gelman's work, quote, makes all previous biographies of Nixon obsolete. Stanley Cutler, a historian who's not exactly inclined to agree with Irv's finding, concedes that Irv has, quote, an unmatched understanding of Nixon's early career. And that brings us to the topic of tonight's talk, King, Kennedy, Nixon, and the election of 1960. The work he's been doing on particularly the black vote in the election of 1960 will cause, I think, many of us to reconsider our analyses of that election. It also, I think, will cause many of us to revise our conclusions about significant episodes in the early civil rights movement. Unfashionable as it may be in this era of theory, Irv is a careful, archive-based historian. He's a tireless researcher. He's proudly contrarian, although not only for the sake of contrariness. He goes where the evidence takes him, which makes him a courageous as well as an honest historian. You may think that you disagree with his conclusions, but listen carefully to the evidence he presents. And above all, he's been kind enough to come all the way from Pennsylvania to brave bad weather, delays at airports, to come and share his knowledge with us. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Erwin Gelman.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. First of all, before I get started, I want to thank you. You don't have to talk now with food in your mouth, but for coming. The whole outfit. I thought that I was underwhelming in my suit, but you are the man. Thank you. Thank you. I also want to thank President Dennison for inviting me, and Kathleen Collins. It's her birthday today. She can't come, but she was a jewel. The same thing is true with Kim Lewis, who did my ticketing and had to redo my ticketing. I knew there was a problem in Philadelphia when the captain in our plane said, we have to go through de-icing. The only problem is I can't see the equipment. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, we were off in the air to arrive in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and I only had a 9-hour wait for my next plane to come here. So I'm pleased to see you show up, and I'm going to change my talk with you a little bit, because what I want you to do is I want you to understand how history is done, how history changes, and how you all probably in the future at some time, if you're historians or scholars or whatever branch, even psychologists can do in regard to writing good history. Richard Nixon, the man I'm doing this multi-volume biography, had two major secretaries. One was Rosemary Woods, the other was Louis Gaunt. To tell you how devoted they are, or were, Rosemary Woods died of Alzheimer's 7 years ago. Louis Gaunt still works at the Nixon Library and Birthplace. She's in her late 80s. She still goes out there. She still reveres the man that she called the boss. So they did an incredible job of saving material. Now, the reason why I'm here, and I don't know if Susan Mayer showed up, and I don't know how many of you take history classes and how many of you know Michael Mayer, but he's the reason why I'm here. He's read some of my material. In addition to that, he is the finest scholar of Eisenhower's civil rights in the judiciary in the world. He's the best. So you should be very pleased here at the University of Montana that you have somebody quite as good as he is. I'm kind of a schlemiel, you know, compared to him. He really is the real deal, and you should be quite pleased that he is there. I don't know if his wife is here. Susan, are you here? You did really good. You did really good. And you know, unfortunately, I got my hands ruined in a car crash. Some creep gave me a choice of putting my head through the thing or grabbing onto the steering wheel. Will you give him a hand? Clap. Thank you, I appreciate it. But he's been incredibly kind to me. I really am not a trained African-Americanist, but so you know my background. I did teach and was a dean at a black college. I was the only white dean sitting with 28 department chairs in front of me, and I have great stories about that. My mother was 5'0", and in 1955 she broke the Lyric Theater in Baltimore and brought Marian Anderson into town. Probably the thing I'm best known for is the reason why I became a dean is I ended up trying to get black kids to go to graduate school to get graduate degrees, and most of my colleagues when I taught at Morgan were not into helping all that much, although that may seem surprising to you that, black professors were not helping the black students, but there's an anomaly in that. So I sent about 100 kids in my stay there with full scholarships, anything from Harvard to UCLA to Texas to Indiana to wherever. And they surprised me, and they wrote me for years and years and years, thanking me and telling me how they progressed. And in addition to that, I have a friend named Barbara, and she lives in Newport Beach, and here's her daughter who relocated to Missoula, and it's just a pleasure to see you and know you're here. And now the introductions are over. What I want to do is I want to end with the election of 1960. But what I want to do first is to demonstrate to you how poorly history is done in some cases. What my volume on Eisenhower and Nixon entails is about 3 million pages of documents. That's what I do. I am a Neanderthal. I do the research until it's over. And if it's not over, I keep on doing the research until it's over. And normally when my editor gets my book or my manuscript, he normally has to pull it out of my hands, kicking and screaming, because I won't give it to him, because I know it can always be done better. But sometimes you just got to stop. But what I want to start with is to give you an overview of how today most academics, writers, whoever, garbage collectors, view the history of the 1950s. I don't know if any of you know Robert Dallek, Bob Dallek, or not, but he's a famous historian. He does, presidential things. He just came out with a biography of Harry Truman. And on a program in mid-October of this year, he said that civil rights starts with Harry Truman, goes to Lyndon Johnson, and ends triumphantly with Barack Obama. It really sounds good. The problem is, it's untrue. In fact, Mao Zedong had more to do with desegregating the armed forces during the Korean War than Harry Truman did. And Harry Truman is charged with being the man that stopped segregation in the armed forces. Do you know why Mao Zedong had more to do with desegregation than Harry Truman? Well, because of Mao Zedong, all of the frontline white people got killed. So the only thing that they could do in South Korea at the time was bring up the blacks who were not allowed to fight in the front lines. So that desegregated, in effect, the armed forces that was fighting in Korea. The only thing that Harry Truman did was say, I desegregate the armed forces. Beyond that, he did virtually nothing. He is famous, if you will, for an interview he did in 1968, which they are not really happy about distributing at the Harry Truman Library for the amount of times he says some word that is no longer involved. I'll give you a clue. It starts with a letter N and ends with a letter R. And he talks about black folks on a regular basis throughout this interview in 1968. There is nothing in Harry Truman's view that talked about great desegregation or the ability to desegregate. Now, that starts pretty much a wrong-headed view of the facts of history. And history throughout the 1950s, when Eisenhower is president, is a wasteland. Eisenhower comes into the presidency in January of 1953. He does nothing because earlier he's considered to being a twit, not doing much of anything other than to play golf. The revisionists now, because most of his papers are open, consider him brilliant and his presidency a near brilliant presidency. But as far as what he did in civil rights was virtually zilch. Richard Nixon doesn't even rise to zilch. Richard Nixon is an anathema. What happens during the Eisenhower administration? The 1957 Civil Rights Act. But according to every historian, or almost every historian, that was really done by Lyndon Johnson. And we'll get back to this in a second. And after that, he supports Richard Nixon, barely, to become president of the United States. And Richard Nixon, according to the gentleman with the shiny top, received a minimal list of black votes. Jack Kennedy, this great president, received an enormity of black votes. He called up, not on his cell phone, but he called on a telephone. He said, "Hello, Coretta King. I'm sorry your husband's in jail. I sympathize with you. Please know I will do what I can." The thing is, he did. Telephone Coretta King. You know what else he did? I'm going to give you one of my, kind of symbols. You know what he did? Zero. He did nothing. Not one of the national newspapers, not one, carried the story front page. The only newspapers that carried the story of Coretta King front page were black newspapers. They had a circulation totally of about 1.5 million. 68 million people voted in that election of 1960. The highest turnout we've had in the second half of the 20th century. 64% of the population. Abysmal, but the best we've had. Now, since a whole lot of you are probably a whole lot smarter than I am, is there anybody that wants to argue with my short survey? I'm guessing that means no. So I'm telling the story pretty okay? Sir, pretty okay? I mean, is that your understanding? Your daughters? Is that your understanding? Anybody? Did I tell it like basically what you're reading in your history text, etc.? That's the story. Basically, the 1950s is a wasteland of civil rights. Now let me pose a question to you. Assume for a second that what I said about Harry Truman, talking the talk but never walking the walk, is true. And suppose we say that it's LBJ that passes the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65. Do you believe that between 1952, when Harry Truman leaves office, 1952-53, when he leaves office, to 1964-1965, that it's a wasteland? Everybody who reads Parting the Waters by Taylor Branch knows the history of the growth of Martin Luther King Jr. He becomes a major player that we know now as the winner of the Nobel Prize, I Have a Dream speech, standing in front of the Lincoln Monument, etc. But most people don't realize when he comes to prominence, he's not prominent. He leads a group of people in 1955, 1956, called the Montgomery Bus Boycott. It's in Alabama. It's designed for people in Birmingham. It is not a national issue. It is not that big a deal. Rosa Parks, who said, "No, I'm not getting out of my seat," does not become a big deal until you all. This is not a national thing. In addition to that, think about the leaders of the NAACP having a 26-year-old challenging them for supremacy of popularity in the African American community. Roy Wilkins, who was the executive secretary of the NAACP, certainly didn't like it. Neither did many other black leaders, to have an upstart 26-year-old take it over. This is not something that black leaders or white leaders would respond to well. Now let me give you my history based on looking at new documents that were available but people don't look at. Dwight Eisenhower. Was he a racist? Didn't he care? Was he somewhere in between? And maybe he was a closet miscegenationist. Maybe he was dying for Mamie to lose her bangs and lose her pink things and marry some black woman. Who knows? You don't know until you look at the record. Well, if you look at Dwight Eisenhower's record, you find out, one, he was a general. Anybody want to argue with that? I don't think so. But guess what? He had a valet, orderly, a Sergeant John Money, from the Torch invasion in North Africa all the way through World War II, the Normandy invasion. John Money works for Eisenhower until Eisenhower dies. And when Eisenhower dies, he's named an honorary pallbearer. Guess what color John Money was? He was black. Eisenhower comes back, becomes the president of Colombia in 1948, 1949. John Money has a wife. Her name is Dolores. She works for Mamie as her confidant, cook, helper, etc. I know this is going to surprise you, but she was black also. She becomes a major figure in Mamie's life. As a matter of fact, she doesn't go anywhere without Dolores. They're as thick as can be. Now, does that make Eisenhower a civil rights advocate? No. It makes him have two people that he's seeing every day close to him. As a matter of fact, Eisenhower disapproved of interracial marriage. He didn't have the Moneys, quote unquote, as friends. They were family. Now, how in the world can you make the distinction between racism on one hand and integrationists on the other hand? Well, Dwight Eisenhower was a 19th century man. He was a military officer, and many of the people he graduated from West Point with were Southerners. Eisenhower, from his standpoint, took the view that all men were created equal. But in the words of Earl Warren, he was at a stag dinner in 1954 with the president, and the president said, "Would you want your daughter marrying a big black buck?" The answer being no. And the answer in Eisenhower's mind was no. I don't know about you today, but today most people are very liberal in regard to this. If you're in love with somebody, you want to marry them, you want to live with them, whatever, that's fine and dandy. But to Eisenhower, growing up in Abilene at the end of the 19th century, being raised in the 20th century, but really being a 19th century man, that was okay. That was where he was coming from. Do you know how many people have written about this side of Eisenhower? Again, my prop, 0. No one has talked about Sergeant Money and his wife. As a matter of fact, she's in her 90s these days. She still goes to visit the Eisenhower farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. She brings her church group with them. They have lunch at the farm. Guess who pays for it? Have you ever heard of two names, David and Julie? They are still, to this day, supporting Dolores Mooney, Richard Nixon, that evil guy, that degenerate, a guy in Watergate. Who wants to compliment Richard Nixon? Nobody. Do you know who was the major figure in the 1950s favoring civil rights? I was shocked. It's Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is Vice President of the United States. Dwight Eisenhower, in August of 1953, says, Dick, I'm appointing you the chairman of the President's Committee on Government Contracts. That was a euphemism for get black people jobs. He sat on that board with Walter Reuther, Helen Reed, who was the publisher of the New York Herald Tribune, and other major heavyweights, George Meany of the AFL. And his job was to get access to jobs for black people and bring them into jobs they didn't have. I mean, we're talking big, important jobs, like being a bus driver, being a secretary, jobs that black people couldn't get in the 1950s. And this was the clarion call that Eisenhower gave to Nixon. Nixon held this job from the 1953 fall date all the way until he runs for president in 1960. This was not a minor job as far as the movement of black people into mainstream business. How in the world does this happen? Oh, do you know who the first major political figure in the United States was who goes to black Africa? Anybody know? Guess what? In March of 1957, Richard Nixon heads the delegation to go to Ghana. He is the first major white official to go there. He represents the United States not only in Ghana, but Ethiopia. He goes to the Sudan. He goes to other places there as America's representative to the dark continent. No pun intended. But imagine, there's only Ghana and several other nations in Africa that are independent. Nixon is the first person to draw attention to Africa from the United States. If you looked in the card catalog at the Library of Congress, there might have been 5 or 6 sites directed towards Africa and what black Africans were. But when Richard Nixon goes there, this is covered in every major newspaper across the United States. By the way, do any of you know how many articles are written about Nixon's trip to Africa? Again, my prop, 0. None. And in addition to that, do you know how sexy it gets? Richard Nixon, when he goes to Africa, meets Martin Luther King Jr. there. He doesn't meet him in Alabama. He doesn't meet him in Georgia. He meets him halfway across the world in Ghana. And he doesn't meet him purposely. He meets him by accident. They're walking on the university at the same time. But here is what Nixon is doing. Do you know who manages the Civil Rights Bill in 1957 and in 1960 for the administration going through the U.S. Senate? Guess what? Nixon's the one. Nixon is the person that is running for the GOP, the program. Lyndon Johnson, as directed by Caro, Robert Caro's book, The Master of the Senate, which won the Pulitzer Prize, has no clue what he's talking about. He doesn't do the research. He writes beautifully. And it's made it to make it appear that Lyndon Johnson was the maven that produces this legislation. Question for you to think about. Who initiated the legislation? The Eisenhower administration. Who runs the legislation which easily passes the House of Representatives? Lyndon Johnson? I don't think so. Who manages the bill going through the U.S. Senate? Richard Nixon. I ask you, just rhetorically, does that make it sound like Lyndon Johnson was the man responsible for passing the Civil Rights Act of 1957? How can you say that if you do the legitimate research? Now, along in the first term of Eisenhower, you have the election in 1952. Eisenhower says, when he before he's even running, he's called before the Senate Military Affairs Committee. And they ask him, what would you do to integrate the armed forces? And in 1948, Eisenhower says that it's not ready yet. We need to keep segregation so we can keep the blacks in a relative stable position. The brighter black people get higher positions. The less need to be educated more and more. Maybe it offends you, but in 1948, that was the rule, not the exception. There was no ugliness to this. This is what was necessary. The great term of Eisenhower and just about every white person was, you people need to be patient. Do you have a clue how that fries black people? You people, one, they hate the term. And two, patience. They're slaves. Now they're citizens, but they're second or third class citizens. Imagine today that we talk about making people equal in the eyes of the law. How awful must that be? You know, I had, when I was a dean, a box of Kleenex on my desk because I needed it for so many kids that came in and told me horrific stories about what's happening to them on a black campus. Forget about with whites. On a black campus dealing with black faculty. And some of the stories were outright painful. But that was the world that they lived in. You had to, over the years, if you were black, know that you were a second-class citizen. Now, I know I'm not black. I know from the best I can see in this room that none of you guys are black. Imagine everywhere you went and how you lived, you were being emasculated. You were being emulsified. You weren't worth your body just because you were a different color. And this was painful for many people. If you go today on any black campus, and I'm looking in this audience here, I doubt that 15% of the population in a historically black school is male. I would think that there are more black young males in jail than there are on black campuses. But that was the state of the world, not only the United States, Great Britain, France, etc. That was the nature of the times. Now here's Martin Luther King Jr. Never worked a day in his life going to school. Didn't work going to the theological academy. Didn't work on his PhD. Had his own car to drive around in. Didn't have to hustle for a nickel. You think that was standard for black kids in the 1950s? That they could just sit along, study, and not work? I had kids that worked 2, 3 jobs. They were the first people in their class from families that didn't have people graduating from high school. And that was the nature of what it was. So try to, go back to the 1950s. The nature of what becomes Brown versus Board of Education in May of 1954. This was huge. And it was a judicial action. Again, the man to talk to is Professor Mayer. But all of this occurs in the 1950s. How can you call this a wasteland? By the way, Richard Nixon, this awful guy who now I'm trying to change your view of in the 1950s, when he went to Whittier College in the 1930s, he promoted two guys to be members of his social fraternity, the Orthogonians. One's name was Nathaniel George. He was a track star. And one was the starting halfback on the football team. His name was William Brock. Guess what color their skin was? They were blacks. And here is Nixon promoting them. Nixon was a steeplehouse Quaker, which meant that they had a pastor, they had music, they didn't have kind of the Gary Cooper sitting around, praying and having the inner light. These were basically revivalist, activist churches. On August 19th, 1952, Nixon gets a letter while he's running for the president. He's nominated for the vice presidency from Bill Brock saying, Dick, I don't know if you remember me, but I was in your class. When I graduated in 1935, a year after Nixon, I couldn't get a job. I became disillusioned and joined the Young Communist League. And after World War II, they asked me on my loyalty oaths, because loyalty oaths were a big deal, especially if you're working for a defense contractor, and Bill Brock was an engineer, if I had any relationship to the Communist Party. And like an idiot, he answered truthfully and said yes. He was fired. He wrote to Nixon saying, I don't know what to do. I need my job. I am a good American. When the FBI came and saw me, I told them everything I remember about the Communist Party. The FBI agent that saw him, truly, I'm not kidding now, his name was Joe McCarthy. And Joe McCarthy spoke up for Bill Brock and said, yes, he is a good American. Let him go back to work. He could not get a job. Richard Nixon spent from that August, and after he finished running and winning, through his entire vice presidential career with no advertising, no shtick, no anything, to get Bill Brock reinstated. Nixon was different than Eisenhower. Nixon didn't look at blacks as equal or member of the family. To him it was a moral issue from his Quaker upbringing that all God's children are equal. So here you have Brown, the President's Committee on Government Contracts, Eisenhower and his direct relationship with black people, Nixon and his activity with black people. None of this has been written about. Nobody has showed the nuances of the 1950s and what the administration is doing. You go and you see Martin Luther King Jr. step out in the limelight of a southern city. His house, by the way, as you probably know, was bombed. And here he is stepping up even in the 1950s with a possibility of being murdered. But seeing the issue of right and wrong and what you need to do. Oh, by the way, after Nixon comes back from Africa, guess who he holds one of his first meetings with? Martin Luther King Jr. He promised him in Ghana that when he came back to the United States, that they should sit down, and they did. A black guy in the formal offices of the Vice President of the United States? Out of the question. You don't do that. And here Nixon was doing it. In 1952, Eisenhower, because of the way he's thought of being anti-black because his position on the soldiers and segregation, gets between 21 and 27% of the vote, black vote. Adlai Stevenson gets the opposite, high 70s, low 70s. Huge disparity. In 1956, when Eisenhower runs for re-election, he gets between 36 to 39% of the black vote. And Adlai Stevenson goes down. As a matter of fact, more blacks vote in 52 than vote in 56. And whereas many people believe that 1 in 3 blacks vote, the NAACP never comes out with numbers. Now, the man that ran the whole critique for black voting at the NAACP was a man named Henry Moon. He had little sheets for every chapter of the NAACP with who was running, what district, what ward, and how many black votes. No one ever received his totality of count. Moon and the NAACP never released the findings of how many blacks voted from 1952 to 1960. And you know why? Because it was pathetic. I doubt from my figures that more than 2 million blacks voted in 1952 out of 8 million. Now, it doesn't take brain surgery to figure out that's 25% or less. In 1956, less black folks voted, so that means even a lower number because there's a higher black population because of the expansion of blacks, but there's a lower vote. And Eisenhower, I believe, did not receive this enormous increase from 21 to 27% to 36 to 39% because he got an enormity. What I believe happened was black Democrats had no reason to vote for Stevenson in 1956, so you had less voting. And there were less people voting in the black community. Remarkable. Highest number of people, registered voters, voting, and less black people voting. It's not strange. It makes sense knowing the tenor of the times and who was voting and why blacks were voting the way they did. So you have this number that's never disclosed. The only problem is Henry Moon wrote several articles, and I was able to piece together the numbers of black voters from some partial lists he made in 1952 and 1956. And if any of you are interested in a great project for a PhD dissertation, a master's thesis, whatever, is figuring out, because of the segregation at the time, it's pretty easy to figure out how many blacks are voting in cities or whatever at the time. And I believe that my numbers are correct, that this is the nature of black voting. And by the way, blacks are voting 70%, approximately 7 out of 10 in all of these elections, 52, 56, and 60. And the reason being is blacks are becoming more and more powerful in segregated areas of cities. And as black populations grew in cities, they naturally gravitated towards social services. And social services were provided by black precincts and by black politicians. And you owe me for giving your kids food, and I owe you by going to the precinct ward captain and saying, I'm voting a straight Democratic ticket. And that's what happened. Now, this all leads to where we're moving up to 1960. Remember one thing. No Republican nominee for the presidency since 1932 received a majority of black votes. The reason why I had you read the paragraph I had you read, Taylor Branch won the Pulitzer Prize for this one section where he says, Jack Kennedy made this phone call to Coretta King, and the earth to black people came down crushing. I'm exaggerating a bit for purpose. And all of these black people came out of their hovels to show their support. And again, if I'm telling it wrong, he'll tell you. In 1956, Eisenhower got 60% of the black vote. And Stevenson got 40% of the black vote. It wasn't possible. He couldn't have gotten 60% of the vote. No Republican candidate had received a majority of the black vote since 1932. And yet, the American reading public and the scholarly world and the reviewers never picked it up, that this couldn't possibly happen. And yet, this is the projection of what happened. And because of this massive outpouring, in 1960 had Jack Kennedy, JFK, receive 70% of the vote, which was the normal pattern. And Nixon got 30%. Well, the fact is that Nixon probably got more black votes in 1960 than Eisenhower ever dreamed about. He got between 30 and 32%. And with more people voting, he had more black people voting for him, deservedly so. And John F. Kennedy's pattern for blacks. There's a guy named Nick Bryan who wrote a book called The Bystander. I recommend it to you because what it says is this is all crazy. He didn't even have black friends. He didn't get along with black people. He didn't make a positive move towards black people. As a matter of fact, the thing that bothered blacks more than anything in this, before the '60 election is one of the first guys to come out favorably for Nixon, for Jack Kennedy, was a governor named John Patterson. Oh, I forgot to mention, John Patterson of Alabama. Imagine how black people enjoyed pictures of Patterson's arm around Kennedy and them being pals. Not a good scene, not a good scene, but Patterson supported Kennedy and the South pretty much goes for John Kennedy. He knew that he needed white segregationist votes in the South. Martin Luther King Jr. moves from his triumph, if you will, in Birmingham to the head of the Southern Leadership Conference, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and goes and has his father's church in Atlanta. He has a choice. Who is he going to support in the 1960 election? You know what he comes out with? I'm not supporting either of these guys. And by the way, you all remember pictures of Kennedy walking in with his wife Jackie to vote? Do you all remember the pictures of Nixon and his wife Pat voting in Whittier when they vote? How many of you remember the picture of Coretta King and Martin Luther King Jr. voting in the 1960 election? Is that a look of, I have no clue what you're talking about? You know what? He didn't vote. He couldn't meet the registration requirements. So in 1960, Martin Luther King, who was encouraging all black people to vote, doesn't vote. Do any of you remember when Daddy King, his father, said, I really don't care, even if Jack Kennedy is Catholic, I'm going to give him a satchel full of votes? That's true. The problem is, what nobody tells you is, his district in Atlanta goes Republican. So maybe the satchel was only half full. I don't know. And how many Catholics would like to hear, any of you Catholics? Ah, goody. You know, I like you. I like your mom, even if you are Catholic.
Thank you.
Don't mention it. Do you know how many times I've heard that as a Jew? The fact of the matter is there was nobody who was really believing that this was anything other than a personal thing. And Daddy King was expressing his gratitude. But imagine saying, you know, I'm going to vote for you even if you are Catholic. What a left-handed compliment that is. And here is the book. Here is Parting the Waters. And here is the end of the election of 1960. And you know what? The fascinating thing about it is from then until now, Republicans and Democrats say that Richard Nixon, one of the main reasons he lost, was because of this incredible shift of voting of black people to the Democratic Party. There was virtually no shift at all. And yet they've gotten it wrong for 50 years. Go figure. All you had to do was read the same passage that you read. Have I been exaggerating? No. How in the world can anybody believe that 60% of voting blacks voted for Eisenhower when it never happened since 1932? And yet, if you read history books today, if you read African American textbooks today, there is this crazy story. He called Coretta King and blacks kept coming out of the sky. That's the story of what you will learn and what I am changing, or hope to be changing. Of course, if you notice my back, when I go out, you're going to see a bunch of daggers stuck in, and I'm going to be bleeding a lot, because people are going to be incredibly resistant to the fact pattern which they don't approve of. It doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is the evidence is there. The evidence is incontrovertible. Now, before I finish, I want to make a personal observation. I was also, when I was a kid, the only white lifeguard in a black swimming pool. I've known, my best academic friend is David Levering Lewis, who's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes and won a MacArthur Genius Prize. Why he deals with me, I have no clue, but I read all of his stuff. He's black. His wife is black. We're friends. Not in the thought of, well, I need a black friend here or there so I can come to audiences like yours and say, you know, I like black folks. Has nothing to do with it. I'm equal opportunity. I really am, you know, a racist in ways. I hate stupid people. I don't care what color you are. It doesn't matter to me as long as you're a decent human being. But what people forget, and what you as scholars and students have to remember, be skeptical. I'm not a contrarian, as one of us have pointed out that I am, and I'm not a revisionist, as one of us point out. You can tell them later I'm pointing out. All I'm trying to do is look at the record. If it were 3,000 pages, that would be fine if it covered the story. But it's 3 million pages, and it covers the story. And that's the story I want to tell. It doesn't matter if it was Richard Nixon or Simon Legree, wherever the fact pattern leads. And one of the reasons why I do the research I do and enjoy doing Richard Nixon is not because he's my fearless leader or because I'm a Republican or a Democrat. It's because I don't have to fill in the blanks. That with 3 million pages, I can take fact patterns and work them out and be pretty confident I'm telling the story the most objective, fairest way I can. Because, quite frankly, when somebody comes up to me and says, Irv, I've read your stuff and it's great. There's no greater high to me to know that people who read my material depend on it. The biggest critic at the New York Times, he read David Greenberg. But the guy that really scared the death out of me when I wrote The Contender was Michael Bernstein, Richard Bernstein, who was the principal Cold War reviewer for the New York Times. And in his review, pardon me, I'll step back a second. He asked to review the book. And I'm going, whoa, the principal New York Times critic wants to read the book. This can be really bad news. Wrote the review on my birthday. Because there was a 3-hour difference and I was living in California, we were able to bring it up. It was a whole column all the way down. And he said, not only did I like it, but you may not like what Gelman says about Nixon, but you better read it and you better respect it. And from my standpoint, that's probably as good as I'm going to get with what I do. As good as you get is the obvious thing that I'm pressing for. Be thorough. Don't be attuned or don't accept what people say that you think is demonstrably wrong. Follow the nature of your minds. You know, you all have them. They're all to be used. Get the story not as somebody else writes it necessarily, unless you agree with it, unless the facts check. Get the story right, because there's nothing more profitable, at least to me, than knowing that what I'm telling you is the best I can be. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. What? Do you want any questions, or have I baffled you with my brilliance and something else that rhymes with that has a little, bunch of 4-letter words? Anybody? Sir.
What was Nixon's role during the Johnson years when the civil rights legislation was actually passed?
What was Nixon's role? He had almost zero. And since you were kind enough to answer me the question, please don't ask me about what I've not written on, because it gets into my head and I start trying to figure out what's right, and invariably I'm wrong. Okay, ask me about his congressional years, ask me about his vice presidential years. That stuff, I really know where I'm sitting, and I don't want to get it wrong with you. Anybody else? Sir.
You mentioned Philadelphia.
Yes.
Are you from Philadelphia?
I was born in Philadelphia, but lived in a slum called Newport Beach for years. Unfortunately, I had what you call a quadruple bypass. And I do a lot of radio and television out of New York and D.C. And my doctors didn't want me to fly back and forth. So I stay in the Philadelphia area. And actually, it's kind of good because most folks don't know me there, and they don't bother me.
I have a very good friend who is in radio and TV in Philadelphia, a Jewish lawyer, friend of mine. I'll give you my card.
Okay.
Look him up when you get there.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Jewish lawyers. That's an oxymoron.
No, he's good.
Okay.
I
Okay.
can add more to that, but I won't.
Okay. Anybody else? Sir.
Just for the fun of it, you're trying to say that the Republican Party has historically supported black people. And
Pardon?
You're saying that the Republican Party has historically supported black people and civil rights more than we would like to believe, or?
No, what I'm saying is, from my research in the 1950s, that to answer it a little fuller, what I think happened was that in the 1950s, the Ivy Leaguers, who had graduated from especially Columbia, could not stand Eisenhower. because Eisenhower was president of Columbia. He was not a scholar. All he did was raise money for their endowed chairs. But intuitively, you know, in my case, being by nature a capitalist pig, most folks don't realize that. And academics especially, one of my favorite terms is, they argue about over little things for such a long time that it's absurd. But in the case of these guys that supported Adlai Stevenson, they were huge stars. I mean, Richard Hofstadter, I've read his stuff, thought it was brilliant. Theodore White, The Making of the President, when I read it 40 years ago, it was brilliant. Now it's just garbage. If you read his volume called In Search of History, which is his autobiography, do you know why he started that book? Do you have any clue? He started it because he had already had the ideal villain of Richard Nixon. How can you write history and make it thematic and make the Kennedys Pamela Purity and husband Purity and not know what you're talking about? What I'm saying to you is in the 1950s, the Republican record is far better than it's portrayed. It's not a wasteland. You know, what I did not point out, and I apologize for forgetting about that, do you know who really desegregated the military in the 1950s? It was Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower gave orders to his Secretary of Defense that you will desegregate all of the military. The South resisted, and he said, doesn't matter. I am the commander-in-chief. You will desegregate. Also, Washington, D.C. was segregated, and a black could not go to a decent hotel, could not go to a decent restaurant, etc. And Eisenhower desegregated Washington, D.C. It wasn't anybody putting pressure on this guy. This guy believed in equal opportunity of all races. He just didn't believe, bless you, the miscegenation and intermarriage. By the way, a thing I didn't also tell you was when Eisenhower and said that he and Walter White agreed that intermarriage was bad. Walter White was married to a white woman at the time, and Walter White's daughter, who was black, married a white man. Go figure. But that's what I'm trying to tell you is the maximum that I can say from the research. I don't know in the 1960s what Barry Goldwater did. I have a clue. And I have a clue what Nixon did. But until I really know, I just don't want to express an opinion. I don't know if that answers your question or not. Okay, yes, sir.
One other remark. Central High School, Little Rock.
Sure.
Eisenhower was involved with.
Well, you know about the Little Rock Nine, the kids that went to Little Rock in 1957 and were stoned and thrown out, and Nixon and Eisenhower brought in federal troops. First, he nationalized the Arkansas National Guard, and then he brought in troops. What you may not know is, do you know what troops he brought in? He brought in the 101st Airborne. Why did he bring in the 101st Airborne? Because those were the folks that led the invasion at Normandy. They were his boys. I don't mean that to be funny either, but they were prime combat troops, and he meant business. There was not going to be any violation of federal law. Those kids had as much right as anybody else to go to Central High School. And if racists or unracists or marshmallow people were going to stop them, that was not acceptable. Period, exclamation point. Anybody else? Sir.
1967, Stokely Carmichael and his associate Charles Hamilton come up with a book called Black Power.
Right.
For the first time, they articulate the difference between institutional and individual racism using those.
By the way, can you hear him? Okay, but you can hear him a little bit. Can you speak a little louder?
We're talking about the black power, black nationalism emerging in this country in 67 and 68. That's a very different take on the way one describes and articulates the problem of racism than Eisenhower's worldview, for example. Can you talk to us a little bit about how Nixon was responding to the black nationalist impulse in this country, 68, 69, 72, it's during his ascendancy that this is going on. How is he engaging with that kind of black voice as opposed to a much more or less in-your-face voice that was part of the community prior to the articulation of black?
Okay, to be equal opportunity, I can't answer that question. I don't know it enough. But I will tell you this, that my understanding of Richard Nixon, as seen through his Quaker inner light, was initially, and probably through the 50s, very much in tune with an equality viewpoint. Black power and anything like that. Eisenhower promoted the issue of extremists are wrong. Now, you brought it up. I'm going to add something that I thought of. Thank you. Any of you know who Billy Graham was? This is no surprising guy. Okay, you all know he's an icon. He's famous worldwide. They may know him on Mars. Did you know he was one of the first people to desegregate his crusades? That he stopped and told people they could not segregate his audiences anywhere in 1953? He becomes close to both Eisenhower and Nixon. In 1956, Eisenhower tells Graham, it would be really nice of you to bring major speakers to your crusades and to your conferences to discuss integration through moderate means, because the extremists on the right and the extremists on the left were bad people. They were folks that were doing no good to anybody. Nixon parroted this in full. And guess who was the first guy that went to Billy Graham's crusades in Ridgecrest, North Carolina, where Graham lived, in August of 1956, to preach moderation, integration, and job equality? Surprise, surprise, Richard Nixon. And guess what? The first speech he gives during his re-election campaign in 1956 was in Louisville on September 26, 1956. And it was about desegregating the public schools and how well Louisville was responding to that. So the whole nature, I think, that Nixon spends, and by the way, I don't know if you read Dean Kotlotsky's book on Nixon's civil rights, but if you avoid the Joyce Seltzer, his editor, changing some of his conclusions to make it more marshmallow to leftists, it is quite good. His dissertation is actually better than the book, because when you let an editor get involved with your stuff, I mean with your main themes, it really does a disservice to your writing, and she did. But the whole position that Nixon and Eisenhower and most politicians all are saying is, don't get involved with extremists of either ilk, not the White Citizens Council or Stokely Carmichael, Black Power, Malcolm X, etc. And this was a thoughtful thing, because their main view was the art of the possible. And in Eisenhower's case, he really truly believed that gradualism, through education, through job increases, through more black middle class, was really the answer. He never understood, neither do I believe Nixon understood, the innate pain and inequality of treating people, no matter what race, class, or color, that how emasculating it was. Now, when I get to the later thing, we can talk about that because I guarantee I will know. Okay. Anybody else are okay? Did you enjoy the food? Are we done? Is it over between us? Again, thank you so much for coming. I do appreciate it. Have a nice night, and thank you.